time to change, to encourage them. Since we are late, and it's already 11:30, we will now move to discussions, but I would like you to be very brief. We only have 10 minutes because then there will be other presentations with the second panel with a very interesting theme, the successes in regional trade in Africa, which is very important. So when you speak, please state your name, and if you're from an organization, please mention your organization and be brief. We only have 10 minutes to discuss to enable the second panel to continue immediately. Thank you. So there are microphones in the audience, so we'll start from the left of the room. Mr. Advisor from Madagascar. Yes, I would like to speak on my personal name because it's a comment regarding what has been said, especially Mrs. Saarinen. Indeed, it is very nice to increase protection, yields, etc. But as you said yourself, it makes them more and more dependent, especially on inputs. The more you produce, the more you need the inputs. And that leads me to the following reflection. We should also, for ADB, invest to make sure that the farmers don't rely on external inputs. That means developing national inputs with national technologies or even traditional technologies. We have cases for Madagascar where we have a very intensive rice culture system which is very efficient, which could be developed and doesn't need any input, so less dependency on inputs. So if we were to support local national researchers to have small local Monsanto companies with local technology, it would be more productive than developing and becoming dependent upon inputs. Yes, thank you very much. We only have 10 minutes, so let's take next question. So please, panelists, take good note of the questions. Je suis le professeur David du MNRCO.
I'm not convinced. Are you saying that the EU is an example to follow, an example of trust? I have the impression that trust is lost. There's a terrible world existential and trust crisis that is deep, underestimated, and dangerous. And without trust, any policy shall fail, whatever the political program anywhere in the world. So, I don't know, the challenge seems to me to be how to overcome lost trust. This is extremely difficult, not to say impossible. Do the Africans trust the EU? They like its money. It's not the same thing as liking the EU. Thank you.
Merci. Le prochain. Oui.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Josephine. I come from Ghana, and I work with Ricoto International as the inclusive agribusiness manager. So I manage their projects in Africa, Latin America, and Southeastern Asia. But prior to that, I used to manage the agriculture portfolio for the Netherlands Embassy in West Africa, in cocoa, oil palm, fruits and vegetables, poultry, and then aquaculture. Now, with the issue of smallholders and the fact that we know that smallholders contribute a lot to the production and looking at the population, my question, or maybe a comment to Oxfam, is indeed, smallholders, we have to look at their living income, their ability to purchase basic needs. But then missing in the question or in the equation or the picture you presented is also the change of mindsets. If you take cocoa, for example, how do we work with smallholders to see farming as a business? When it's cocoa season in West Africa, it's either the cocoa farmer gets money to get another woman, or they pay for a funeral. Not to derogate our farmers, but these are the realities Africa is dealing with, and we need to have conversations around that. Now, my other question is to the African Development Bank. indeed, we need to look at innovative form of financing. And the question all along is, how do we address the supply constraints? And now we also have an issue of getting youth into agriculture. For example, we have worked with Dutch banks to look at, not looking at only financing of cocoa exports to the EU, but how can they bring money deeper into the value chain where the risks are more, primary production, so that the youth can deliver effective services. Because the youth are doing it, they've digitalized they've shown the business case of providing services to farmer groups. But the question is, where is the financing going to come from? And it needs some form of risk capital to go down into the primary production to upscale the production that we're having, closing the yield gap, so that we can also feed our people. This is my little contribution. Thank you.
Très bien. Dernière question.
Last question. There was someone over there. Because the panelists have to be able to answer the questions. So last question.
PhD student in applied economics at the University of Antwerp. My question is for Ms. Yunusa from the EFDB. I followed with interest what you said about the special industrial economic zones of the African Development Bank. I think that the president of AFDB was actually inspired by one of the first projects that actually pioneered this idea in the DRC. But sadly, that project could not actually survive due to political changes, and so such a great investment has been stalled, and we actually don't know if that will continue. So I think that the issue of addressing just the political economy under which those really ambitious ideas that you want to promote in Africa is very useful, and I would like to see if you can address like what is it that the AFDB can do to actually push those commitments and policies in terms of like long-term development, so that when they start, they will not stall and perhaps not be lost as we see right now in the DRC. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour les questions. Je clôt la discussion.
Thank you for the questions. Now I give the floor to the panelists so that they can answer the various questions, but also make their last statement. Let's start with Mrs. Saarinen. Yes, thank you for the comment regarding inputs.
So, no, nothing to add instead of just saying, yes, these are some of the solutions that can be made to reduce the dependence on external expensive inputs. Similar with Ms. Josephine from Ghana. Yes, I agree. And I think that maybe also highlights the importance of taking a holistical approach to issues, not taking a too narrow look into some specificities of value chains only, but taking a bigger picture into account.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Professor Matthews, trust. Can you speak about trust? Can Africa trust Europe?
Well, I won't go into that particular question, but I think it's a very pertinent point about the loss of trust. And for example, within the European Union, we see now increasing efforts by some countries to attach conditions to do with, for example, the rule of law in terms of policy implementation. But I think at the more basic level, we still do have a huge amount of trust. I mean, the fact of the matter is that dairy products produced in my own country of Ireland, can be sold and will be accepted in all of the other 27, 28 countries of the European Union. And that comes down partly, as I say, to the fact that there is a minimum standards across the European Union through legislation. So that is important. But then it's also the enforcement of these standards. So trust is not just a matter of sort of waving our hands. I mean, there is the possibility to bring countries before the European Court of Justice. It's part of the European institutional setup I didn't have time to go into. But so you do have infringement procedures, and if countries have failed to implement the legislation, then they can be brought to account. So I think at the level of trade in agriculture and food, we still have that sense of trust, but it builds on a legal framework, which is very important.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Yunusa, there was a direct question to you.
Very much. I'll take the last two questions. I believe the first question was from Josephine, looking at the issue of innovative finance and access to finance. There's no doubt this is a critical issue. It's sort of the elephant in the room, really, when you look at promoting agribusiness, particularly for medium and small-scale enterprises who do constitute, the largest proportion of actors in the agribusiness space in Africa. What we're realizing is the funds exist. Yes, commercial banks often have the money, but there is a lot of risk perception attached to farmers, smallholder farmers, and SMEs. So the question now becomes, how do we address that? Now, there are several things we can look at, and the African Development Bank, of course, is engaging with a lot of commercial banks to address this space. We have realized that we cannot remove commercial banks from the equation because they are the last mile. So development institutions like the AFDB or the World Bank cannot reach that last mile effectively. So there is need to work with commercial banks, there's need to work with private equity investors really to target that space. But what we can do is really to support the policy discussion around access to finance, to involve the central banks in the discussions, because that is the only way that we're going to be able to reduce the cost of capital to that segment of the customers. Now, coming to the question of the special agro-processing zones, I just would like to clarify that AFDB joined the discussion about the Bokanga-Lonzo industrial zone after it had advanced quite a bit. It was essentially a government project, and I think that highlights what we need to avoid going forward. It cannot be a public sector only driven investment. We have realized after several investments in Africa that it cannot only be private sector. It must be a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. In fact, it must be led by the private sector. What the public sector can do is really to create an enabling environment to allow the private sector to actually prosper. In terms of governance, it is very clear that governance and political will is indispensable. If that does not exist, it will be very difficult to sustain any type of investment. So what we're trying to do really at the African Development Bank is to bring the players on the table to really understand what the challenges are and to focus on investing in the quick wins and also in terms of long-term investments, what will be sustainable. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Enfin,
Thank you very much. Finally, Mr. Boué, you have something to say? No, nothing.
Bien, je vous remercie.
Okay, I would like to thank you and thank all the people who have asked questions. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you again to Mrs. Boto for this kind invitation, and I hope that we will be moving to the coffee break that will be limited to 5 or 10 minutes to enable the second panel to take place. So we'd like to thank all the organizers, and with great pleasure I take part in the Brussels briefing.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists, thank you to the chair, to the questions. I know some few people had the questions, but keep them for the second panel because everybody will have a chance. We have 3 speakers indeed, very interesting, that come from far, some of them. So the coffee is just opposite. 10 minutes, please. Don't have me to look for you again and again and again. Come quickly. Thank you. Yes. All the presentations will be online as well if there are no more copies, so don't worry. We take care of that.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, ambassadeur.
Merci beaucoup.